Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Kirsten Dunst, Wagner Moura and Cailee Spaeny are on the front line of an American Civil War. In the near future, America is under the rule of a fascist president played by Nick Offerman, who is at civil war with the Western forces, a collection of successionist states fighting to restore democracy. Photojournalist Lee, played by Kirsten Dunst, and journalist Joel, played by Wagner Moura, believe the president will soon be overthrown and set out to drive to Washington DC with the intention of interviewing the president before he's defeated. They're joined by veteran journalist Sammy, played by Stephen McKinley Henderson, and young photographer Jesse, played by Cailee Spaeny, as they journey closer and closer to the front lines of the conflict. Civil War is the latest from writer-director Alex Garland, whose work I've liked quite a bit in the past. As a writer, he's frequently collaborated with Danny Boyle on the likes of 28 Days Later and Sunshine. I've always felt like Sunshine was 2/3 of a great movie, and then it goes a bit off track in the final third where it suddenly turns into a slasher. But I really liked his Dread reboot that he wrote, and rumour has it, he was quite influential on the post-production of. As a director, I was blown away by his debut feature Ex Machina. That was one of my favourite films of that year, and it still holds up. It still feels very eerily prescient, especially with the AI debate that's going on right now. I think that's still Garland's best feature, but I do have to add a bit of a caveat to that, because I still haven't caught up with Annihilation yet, owing to the fact that it wasn't theatrically released over here, which is very unfortunate. But I did go and see Men, and while I like the concept of it and some of the elements, it felt like it got tangled up in its own body horror towards the end of it and got very muddled. Garland's films tend to be quite divisive and polarising with audiences, and I think that's because they're as much about what the audience brings to the films as what the films say to the audience, and I think that very much influences how they're perceived and how they're taken away by so many of them. It's understandable why Civil War has been so polarising in its response. In fact, it's rather fitting for a film of this particular ilk, but not for the reasons that you'd necessarily suspect, given the subject matter. What I don't think has helped with that is the marketing. This is the biggest budget A24 film to date, and what they've done is they've marketed it like it's a big budget action blockbuster, especially in the later promotions, which really focus on the gunplay and the military elements, playing to an ooh-rah crowd, and that's not what the film is in the slightest. Those are peripheral elements at best, and really, the film is at its heart a road movie. It's not really an action film per se, and I think that is giving people a completely different expectation of what it really is to begin with, that definitely isn't helping a film that was already probably going to split audiences right down the middle. But I think we should also learn the lesson: never ever trust an A24 marketing campaign. They have literally made misleading trailers a part of their MO. They are trying to sneak art house films by presenting them in the most mainstream manner possible, and making a movie like this look like it was directed by Michael Bay might be some of their finest trolling yet. But it is astonishing just how divided the discourse has become about Civil War, and the one thing that kept coming up over and over again online was that it was apolitical or politically neutral, which is a criticism I don't agree with in the slightest. For a start, because you literally cannot be apolitical with a story like this. You literally cannot make a movie about a civil war and not have politics in it in some way, even if you were trying to avoid it. But also because I literally don't think that's the right word. Maybe impartial was the word they were looking for, but I don't think I agree with that as a way to describe the movie either, because it's not impartial and it's not apolitical. In fact, the movie literally comments on the fallacy of being apolitical. At several points, the characters mention how they have relatives that just trying to pretend like this isn't all happening. They're just lying low on their farms, essentially, relying on the privilege of not having to be directly involved in this on a day-to-day basis. But there's also the sequence where they drive into a small town and they're disconcerted by the fact that everything feels normal, or at least the way they remember normal feeling. And that's especially disconcerting for the audience as well, because everything we've seen of America up until this point has been disrupted. There are bodies strewn on the ground, explosions, bombs, power cuts, people displaced, everything feels like it's falling apart. And then suddenly it's quiet. Too quiet. They wander into a shop and the shopkeeper just says, "Oh, we just don't try to pay attention to what's on the news." But then they wander outside and look up and realise that there are snipers pointed on the building, looking out for trouble. And the underlying point is fairly clear. There is no such thing as being apolitical, and the privilege of being so-called apolitical is usually backed up by violence that is just casually out of people's eyesight, that they just choose not to look at. It's not a particularly subtle metaphor, but it's a pretty clear point about warfare. But I can also understand the criticism to a certain extent, because there are certain details in the film's setup that don't entirely hold up to scrutiny. The one thing that raised a lot of eyebrows, even back in the trailers, was the fact that the Western forces are led by a coalition of the red state of Texas and the blue state of California in a somewhat unlikely political union, and I'm sure that didn't escape the notice of even the British Alex Garland. I do think that is a somewhat deliberate choice on his part. I do think that that is a actual point in those critics' favour, and I think that Garland didn't necessarily want this to be red versus blue, but I do think there is a sizable amount of the audience that do want it to be about that, especially because there is no escaping the fact that this is a movie being released in an election year, so it already feels a bit testy and a little bit kind of tense to begin with. So I think that is what people expected the movie to be, and instead I don't think it is necessarily about that, or at least not on a kind of just very, very broad binary. I think people want it to be explicitly commenting on this specific moment right now, and they want the characters to almost be talking right down the barrel of the lens, literally telling the audience exactly what the film is trying to say. I just don't think that Garland is interested in that particularly. But while Civil War isn't directly about right here, right now in 2024, it is undoubtedly influenced by our political moment. A movie like Civil War, which was written in 2020 and 2021, would not exist without things like the Trump presidency or January 6th. Those were undoubtedly influential on the creative process of the movie, and it plays upon those fears. It plays upon those contemporary concerns and our fear that it could actually get even worse than that. Nick Offerman's fascist president might not necessarily be a one-to-one Trump analogue, but the fact that he's introduced reciting a speech talking about a glorious victory that is patently a lie, it's not very subtle to guess who that might be specifically based upon. The fact that he's so distrusting of journalists that they're treated like, quote, enemy combatants in Washington. The fact that we have characters that are committing genocides and exterminating people that are explicitly non-Americans in the case of the Jesse Plemons scene. A movie that has that scene in it cannot be by nature apolitical. That is an extremely political scene in the movie, and I didn't sit there watching that moment going, I wonder if this is kind of both sides. I can't tell which side that person is on. Pretty obvious which side the Jesse Plemons character comes from and who he might have been inspired by in terms of his rhetoric and personality. The film's politics are undoubtedly painted with a fairly broad brush, and you don't have to agree with them or its commentary, and there probably is room for something more incisive in terms of its politics, but to say that it's apolitical or that it's absent entirely is at best overly dismissive, and at worst just plain straight disingenuous in my opinion. But the reason why Garland hasn't focused on that, or the whys and hows of this particular scenario, is that it's beside the point that he's trying to make. Garland has said that he wanted to make an anti-war movie in the vein of Come and See or Apocalypse Now, to cite his own examples, but also saying that anti-war movies are often flawed because despite the filmmaker's attempts to show the horrors of warfare, it still has a kind of seductive appeal. And a great example of this is that scene in Jarhead where the Marines sit down and they're watching Apocalypse Now and cheering on the action. And there is itself an irony in the fact that Jarhead, an anti-war movie, went on to spawn a direct-to-video action series that is basically recruitment propaganda, as if to prove the point. There is a misconception in many Western countries that war does not happen here anymore. It couldn't happen. War is something that happens in other places, far away, places like Ukraine, for example. And instead, Garland forces us to engage with it by placing it right in the heart of America and disrupting normalcy. Some of the most potent and striking images are just the usual American scenes disrupted by warfare. You think of things like a JCPenney parking lot that has a fallen helicopter in the middle of it. It forces the audience to engage with it because suddenly it's right where they live. And that's what's so chilling about it, because actually by doing that, it feels very uneasily plausible. And that is why so much of the movie is genuinely as intense as it is. What Garland gets right with his filmmaking is that there's a real immediacy to it. It puts you right smack down on ground level, and it feels absolutely terrifying to be in the midst of bullets flying everywhere, especially when you're watching the film in the IMAX presentation like I did. Now, I don't usually bring ear protection to the cinema, but knowing my IMAX's stupidly loud sound system, I felt it was a wise precaution, and I'm glad I did, because Civil War is really loud. Like, the explosions felt loud while I was wearing earplugs that knocked down the volume about 10 decibels. Like, the shots firing over your shoulder, they are loud, they are deliberately meant to jolt you, and they are meant to make you feel disorientated, and it is chilling stuff. It puts you in the mindset of the characters that are having to run and try and survive as best they can. But of course, if we're talking about tension, we have to talk about the Jesse Plemons scene, which is literally going to be only referred to as the Jesse Plemons scene from this point forward, because god damn, he just walks on for, 7 minutes of screen time? That is probably some of the most squeaky bum 7 minutes of cinema I've seen in a very long time. Genuinely an absolutely horrific sequence, and Plemons is so absolutely dominating in that screen time. There's a reason why he's been such a prominent part of the marketing campaign, even though he is in the movie for such a brief moment, but he makes such an indelible impression, largely because he plays this character in a terrifyingly understated way. He is genuinely absolutely fantastic in the movie. He just walks in and steals the whole damn thing. And in fact, the only thing that really knocks down that sequence is that Garland, as a writer, decides to add 2 extra characters directly beforehand that you can clearly tell are going to get killed off in this sequence, because that seems a little bit overly transparent, to say the least. At least, if you're going to do that, introduce the characters earlier so it's not super obvious to the audience. But it's also worth noting that what Civil War is doing is not necessarily new. All the way back to the 80s, Red Dawn brought the battle to America's doorstep, in that case Cold War anxieties, and even more shockingly, Invasion USA. More recently though, the point of comparison I was thinking of while watching Civil War, but weirdly very few critics seem to have brought up in their reviews, is the Purge franchise. traumatize. I was far more thinking of that than I was any of Garland's examples, and certainly the Purge films have similarly uncomfortably tense moments and certainly touch on hot political topics and have far more overt satire and commentary than Civil War allows itself to have. I feel like Civil War does tread on a lot of the ground that the Purge movies have done previously. It's just that in this case, it's presented in a more respectable, elevated package, which is not to undermine the effectiveness of it. Civil War is mighty good at what it does. It's just that the Purge movies have also tread down this road before, and arguably might even be more incisive depending on the viewer. But Civil War also sets itself apart from those examples because it's also concerned with the emotional toll living through and more crucially observing these events takes on a person, and photography is a major part of the movie to this end. Kirsten Dunst's Lee, named after Lee Miller, the World War II photographer, which is rather clumsily mentioned in the dialogue, is clearly heavily traumatised from her time in war zones. There's a moment early on where she goes back to a hotel room and she cries in the bathtub. It's a rare moment of emotional vulnerability for the character that often is quite defensive a lot of the time. Dunst is not afraid to make the character quite prickly because she has to be cold and detached because she's trying to repress that trauma. Otherwise, she's not going to function on a day-to-day basis. She's burnt out and exhausted and world-weary, but she has a job to do, and she keeps on doing it. Meanwhile, you have Wagner Moura's journalist Joel, who, on the contrary, actually seems like he's something of an adrenaline junkie, and this seems to be something that pops up several times over the course of the movie. The other journalists that we meet, several of them seem quite adrenaline junkie-like as well, especially the way that they jump between moving vehicles. There is a sense that Joel almost wants to get to the front of the battle. He likes to be in the midst of the gunfire and kind of gets off on the danger of it all. But even then, later in the movie, he does start to become affected by what he sees. He starts to see the real horror of it, and it starts to impact him personally, and he realises that it's more than just simply thrills. And Stephen McKinley Henderson is fantastic as the veteran reporter Sammy. He's someone that everyone respects and adores, but he also should have got out of the game years ago, especially because, as several characters point out, he's too old and he can't run, and that makes him a liability, especially when they're in the midst of danger. But Henderson brings such a fatherly warmth to this character. He's someone that has so much wise advice for the characters and always seems to be looking out for them, and there's a really fatherly quality to him, especially in his dynamic with Lee. He's a character that you feel like you're adoring in the same way that the actual characters are on screen, and Henderson makes that role his own. But most of the film really belongs to Cailee Spaeny as Jessie. She very much impressed me in this movie, even more so than something like Priscilla, which was actually filmed after Civil War despite being released first. She really is the heart of the movie in many ways, and certainly the character that gets the most dramatic evolution over the course of it, and it's a difficult role, not least of which because the character can be somewhat frustrating in the way that she's written at times because she's so impulsive, but Spaeny is riveting in this movie. She starts out as being this massive fan of Lee and just kind of tags along despite Lee's protest because she sees a lot of herself in Jessie, and she knows where this path leads. She knows what she's going to experience and the horrors that she's about to witness. She doesn't necessarily want to put that on Jessie, but Jessie refuses to give up. And there are moments early on where Jessie is completely inexperienced and also not prepared for what she's about to see. There's a moment where she sees two men strung up, bloodied and beaten, and obviously close to being executed, and she's absolutely in horror, but she also admonishes herself because she was so stunned she didn't take a photo. She didn't have something to take away from the horror of that experience. It was Lee that took a photo in that scene. It's a mistake that Jesse won't repeat again. There are several moments later on over the course of the movie where we see the POV of Lee and Jesse's cameras, and Jesse in particular becomes especially adept at getting the shot at the moment of death. Jesse becomes more detached over the course of the movie, the kind of thing that Lee warned her about in the first place, but there is that passing of the guard over the course of the movie because Lee is realising that she can't deal with her job any longer, but Jesse also feels somewhat eager to be in the heart of battle, and so there is that changing of the guard in terms of their relationship, and that makes the dynamic between the two characters interesting because Lee does start to become more of a mentor figure as the film progresses. But I feel like Civil War is better at the journey than it is the destination. The final stretch of the movie where they're in Washington DC at the moment the Western forces arrive trying to take down the White House, it feels like a typical war movie. Explosions, gunfire, soldiers grunting, helicopters flying overhead. It feels like Garland is struggling to make this the anti-war movie that he claims it to be because it falls into that kind of sensationalism. It feels like the final bit of Zero Dark 30 transplanted to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But perhaps the bigger issue with the final portion of the movie is that I feel it's dramatically rushed. There are things the movie has clearly been setting up throughout its entire running time. The problem is that when that moment happens, it occurs so quickly and feels really inorganic. It relies on characters acting very stupidly in this particular instance, and I feel like it doesn't land with the emotional weight it really should, especially because it doesn't linger on it. It feels like it happens so quickly, and then the movie barely leaves you any time to actually process that it's happened in the first place. And then we get into the final scene of the movie, which doesn't feel like the last moments of the film. It feels like there should be a couple of extra moments to wrap up the characters properly, but instead Garland opts to deliberately smash cut into credits directly after the coup de grace and gives us one final image exposing gradually underneath, which, when finally revealed, honestly I felt was a bit on the nose. It deliberately evokes imagery that we saw in the Iraq War, and it just felt a little bit too obvious and a bit pat. It feels like Garland does some big swings in the last 5 minutes of the movie, but goes through them so quickly they don't land properly and honestly feel a bit misjudged. It ends the film on a more sour note than was probably intended. But I also can't deny that this movie really left me shaken. I stepped out of the cinema and I went into the toilet and I started gradually taking out my ear protection, and I just had to exhale to myself and just release the tension that had been built up in me for the last 2 hours. I felt like in that moment, almost comparable to Lee, that I'd been through this awful traumatic thing, that I'd seen sights I didn't want to see, and I just had to take a moment to just reorientate myself back to reality. And that speaks to the effectiveness of Civil War. It does exactly what it set out to do and makes you feel like you're a part of the war zone, and it's even more potent because it feels so chillingly relevant and timely. I do think that in the future this movie will get reassessed, particularly in a less politically frayed moment. I won't deny that it's a flawed movie, but it's an ambitious one that succeeds at more things than it flounders at. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page or YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video, or you can buy me a reel of film at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can join my YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.